Part 1. Winter with No Escape. In 1924, a young and ambitious biologist named James Holloway was invited by the Canadian government to conduct a winter ecological study at Bushwater Lake, a remote, snow-covered region deep within the forests of Ontario. This was a land untouched by modern civilization. No roads, no power, and certainly no people. Local tribes avoided the area entirely, whispering tales of a hunger that lurked beneath the ice and trees, something ancient and always watching. James wasn't alone. Joining him were Freddie Lane, his closest friend from university and a passionate wildlife photographer, and Owen Talbot, a seasoned local hunter hired to guide them through the frozen wilderness. The trio set up camp near the edge of the lake, surrounded by towering pine trees and knee-deep snow, where the sky seemed perpetually cloaked in twilight. The first 2 days passed peacefully. They collected soil samples, tracked animal movements, and documented the frozen beauty. But on the third day, the sky darkened and the wind howled through the trees. Freddie, out taking photos near the forest's edge, returned to camp with a pale face and trembling hands. "I saw something in the woods," he whispered. It was standing just beyond the trees, not a bear, a person, or something that looked like one, but taller, much taller. James chuckled, brushing it off as a trick of the cold. Probably just a lost hunter. But Freddie didn't smile. He stared into the darkness beyond the pines. No, it wasn't wearing clothes. Its skin was white. Deathly white. From that moment on, winter stopped being beautiful. It became a trap. None of them realized they had stepped into the territory of a timeless predator, where hunger is eternal and escape is only a cruel illusion. The silence after the storm was almost unnatural, thick, muffled, as if the snow itself had swallowed up every shred of sound. The group stood at the edge of their camp, the biting air forgotten, as their gazes lingered on the strange trail. There was no logic to what they saw. Nothing in the animal kingdom or their collective experience that explained it away. The long, snaking impressions in the snow glistened faintly, each ridge and dip picking up the watery morning light. Not a single clue as to what made them. No claws, no pads, no familiar sign of wildlife, just that relentless, disturbing drag, winding past the tents, circling, then disappearing into the woods, where the gloom thickened beneath ancient, heavy branches. Owen's declaration left a hollow space in their chests, a mixture of disbelief, dread, and something ancestral they could not quite name. James looked at his companions. Freddie's lips moved slowly, muttering some half-remembered prayer, or maybe just repeating the name, Wendigo, like it was a charm to ward off nightmares. A gust of wind swept through, stirring up little clouds of snow. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath with them. James felt exposed. All of them did, suddenly aware of how the trees pressed in, how the snow muffled their steps, how the sky disappeared behind churning grey clouds. No birds sang. No ptarmigan called. The only sound was Owen's deliberate rhythmic stacking of wood, a practical, stubborn gesture in a place that had stopped making sense. Freddie finally broke the silence. "We need to see how much of the gear is buried. If we're leaving, we shouldn't leave anything behind." His voice wavered, but the necessity in it was firm. Together, they moved cautiously, shoveling snow, unearthing frozen packs, and shivering as they worked. Every footfall was tentative, Every glance flickered toward the tree line, watching for movement, for the glimmer of something impossible. James's mind spun with everything he knew about the legend. The long winters when food was scarce, and the wind howled through cracks in the log walls of frontier cabins. Stories told over generations of people driven mad with hunger, transforming into ravenous creatures. Skin stretched thin over impossible bones, mouths torn wide, eyes black as coal. Wendigo. How could a story like that leave tracks in the real world? But stories lived for a reason, he thought. Maybe they were warnings. Maybe they waited in the marrow of the earth, just beneath reason and modern comfort, until the right moment to become real again. He remembered the way Owen said the word, the way his breath shaped it, carrying not fear exactly, but memory, ancestral bitter truth. Owen was methodical as he inventoried supplies and checked his map. James and Freddie moved around camp, never straying far from the warmth of the fire. Owen forced them to rebuild. Every now and then, James caught Owen's gaze, flicking toward the trail in the snow. There was a grim resolve in the guide's eyes, a man ready to trust old wisdom when the world abandoned sense. They gathered quickly, packs lighter than before. The loss of some buried food supplies accepted with grim resignation. As they shouldered their gear, Owen spoke quietly, almost reverently, as if speaking to the trees themselves. No sudden moves. Stay as close. And if you see anything at all, you speak up. Don't go running off, not even for a second. Freddie adjusted his scarf and tried for a joke, but it melted in the cold, anxious air. Owen led them out, following a different path than the one they'd used to enter, taking them along the higher ridges instead of the denser forest floor. Each footstep landed with a crunch in the snow, and every time a twig snapped, the group startled, expecting what? Something monstrous, perhaps only real in nightmares, to lunge from the shadows. The deeper they trekked, the more ominous the forest seemed. Sunlight barely filtered through the high boughs, casting everything in uncertain twilight. The wind carried a scent that didn't belong. Coppery, raw, like blood on old iron, faint but persistent. James couldn't help but remember every story he'd ever heard, every warning dismissed. The mind played tricks, he told himself, but the quiet was too absolute. No birds, no animals, just the soft hiss of their own breathing. Owen kept glancing over his shoulder. More than once, the group caught sight of fresh marks, the same dragging tracks, here and there, cutting across animal trails, looping back and forth, as if some. It began, as all true calamities do, quietly, almost imperceptibly. A gradual shift, a splintering, as if the world they knew was being peeled away, layer by a fragile layer. The forest that once sheltered them was now only a memory, swallowed during the night by a blinding void of wind and snow. Where the tree line once stood, nothing remained but a horizonless expanse of white, swirling relentlessly in the blizzard's grasp. The wind that had, just the day before, hissed and flickered at the edge of their consciousness, now roared with the rage of an ancient beast, shaking every fiber of their battered tent. They awoke to the sound of silence within and a constant sobbing without. Their supplies, already thin, took on new gravity. 3 days, James counted. 3 days of rations if they stretched every crumb and drop. When he reached for the radio, half hopeful, the static answered with cold indifference. No voice, no reassuring click. They were alone in this wasteland. the closest warmth found only in each other and the fragile membrane of canvas that separated shelter from oblivion. Time became strange, as if the blizzard itself gnawed at the roots of rational thought. Days and nights stretched and collapsed in on themselves in the white monotony. The only markers were the small tasks that kept James's mind occupied, sorting through notes, checking the dwindling food, forcing himself to keep a log he no longer expected anyone to read. The keen edge of hunger sharpened in the background, quietly at first, then gnashing in earnest as the last of their rashes dissolved in their empty hands. By the 5th day, their stores were bare. No more food. The ache in their stomachs became a permanent companion, a slow burn that grew sharper with every hour. Freddie was the first to succumb to something worse than hunger. He shivered violently, drenched in sweat despite the below-freezing air. His breaths came in short, fast sputters, and his hands rattled like leaves in autumn. There was nothing to give him but threadbare warmth and the shallow comfort of James' voice, reassuring, repetitive, the useless rituals of those trapped by circumstance. Owen was different. His strength, so reliable only days ago, seemed to unravel overnight. Withdrawn, silent, his eyes darting in the shadows like a prey animal, sensing the approach of something it cannot outrun. He claimed a corner of the tent and simply vanished into himself. By the 5th night, he had not spoken for hours, lips moving soundlessly. James caught fragments, names, half-remembered sentences, whispered confessions lost to the thickening air. The wind faded as quickly as it had come, yielding to a new, more insidious sound. James lay unsleeping, every muscle tensed, at the mercy of noises he couldn't trust. Then it came, the deliberate scratching, an insistent, almost intimate sound, as if something clawed gently at the tent's thin fabric, not urgent, but curious, calculating. James's every instinct screamed to stay still, but hunger and fear goaded him to act. Gripping his flashlight, he snapped it on, the beam slicing through the darkness. The world outside was still. Snow piled in silent drifts. The wind had left, but so had any sense of safety. For a moment, James thought he must have imagined it. Then, a streak in the snow caught his eye, a thin, red smear, cutting a path away from the tent, disappearing into shadows where the old forest once stood. Blood. Not much, but fresh and alarming. A mark so out of place in the endless monotone of snow and ice that it seemed almost unreal. He shut off his light, retreated into his bag, heart pounding with the rhythm of doubt. If he went outside, what would he find? Something had moved through their camp while they slept. Something alive, or at least something that could bleed. He forced himself to stay awake, listening for the return of scratching, for the low, animal grunt of a predator, for the laughter of a companion on the edge of delirium. But nothing came, only silence, stretched to breaking. Dawn, when it came, offered no comfort. The wind had died. The sun struggled to pierce the clouds, painting the snow with a weak grey light. Every object was stiff with cold and rhymed with the frost, even the interior of the tent. James sat up, blinking blearily at the unfamiliar brightness. Habit forced him to perform a roll call, a ritual he barely believed in anymore. "Freddie!" A feeble groan was his answer. James turned and saw Freddie, pale and glassy-eyed, slack in his bag, sweat dried and crusted on his forehead. "Owen?" Nothing, only the hush of empty space. There was Owen's sleeping bag, still pressed into the corner, but it was empty, sagging. His boots were missing. His coat had vanished. There were no footprints, not even the smallest disruption in the snow around the tent's entry flap. It was as if the blizzard had swept Owen away in the night, except for that memory, sharp and fresh, of scratching claws. James stumbled outside, numb fingers trembling as he unzipped the tent. He searched for the blood streak, willing himself to find tracks or clues. The snow was undisturbed, wind sculpted into towering drifts. No lines in the powder, no indentation to hint at a body dragged or footprints leading away. Just the memory of blood and the echo of a presence that did not belong. He returned inside, clinging to the warmth of Freddy's feverish body, his own mind threatening collapse. No words came easily. They looked at each other, eyes wild and haunted, and understood what the world outside had become. The storm want not merely weather, but a force, a hunger given physical form. It didn't just take warmth and food, it unraveled reason, stole sleep, and now, one by one, it took them. The hunger became more than physical. Each hour without Owen, without even the sound of his breathing, wore at James. He mulled over their decisions, desperate for meaning. Why had they come here? For science? For glory? For the illusion that the world could be tamed by will alone? Now, as senses dulled and hope dimmed, their isolation felt absolute, a punishment imposed by the same cold emptiness that gnawed at their bellies. As night returned and the wind rose once more, James understood. Something outside was watching, waiting. The forest wasn't truly gone, it had merely put on a mask of snow and shadow, laid a trap of hunger and fear. And as he clenched his eyes shut against the darkness, James prayed he would not hear the scraping again. The silence was its own threat, the prelude to a deeper, hungrier cold yet to come. The real ordeal, he now realized, had only just begun. A frigid silence pressed heavy upon the camp as dawn edged its way over the snowbound horizon. Gone was the ordinary rhythm of survival, replaced by a hollow absence that grew deeper with each passing moment. The empty space where Owen should have been. His sleeping bag, his boots, the dent in the mattress, was as loud as a scream. James could barely bring himself to move, the still air thick with dread. His numb fingers curled the edge of his own sleeping mat as he watched Freddy shiver and mutter fitfully, lost in fever dreams. It was colder than yesterday, colder than seemed possible. The world outside had been stripped of color, reduced to shades of white and gray. James pulled himself up, each joint stiff with exhaustion and fear, and crawled over to where Owen had last been. The sleeping bag was cracked with frost, its contents scattered as if abandoned in haste. Under the folds of the blanket, he discovered the battered field notebook. Owen's journal, edges warped, the cover scratched and softened by weather and wear. James's breath caught in his throat as he turned the pages. Early entries brimmed with the disciplined optimism of a survivalist. Sketches of animal tracks, notations on the migration of deer, hand-drawn maps of the nearby stream. Page after page, lists of edible berries, instructions for tying knots, diagrams of makeshift snares. Every word bespoke confidence, method, assurance, a testament to Owen's belief that knowledge was a shield against all dangers. But as he neared the back of the journal, the pages changed. The handwriting grew less controlled, the lines less straight, the ink shaky, and sometimes smudged, as if the pen had stuttered in a trembling hand. It was as if the cold had seeped into the bones of even the ink. Margins were crowded with erratic scribbles, crossed-out words, frantic sketches of branching trees, and blank-eyed faces. James's eyes darted over the increasingly wild scrawl, dread mounting with each fragment of thought. And then, the final entry, a sequence of jagged words that looked as if they'd been slashed onto the page. I saw it, standing between two trees. It didn't move. But every time I blinked, it was closer. My grandmother warned me. She said, if you look too long, it learns your name. Don't let it say your name. James's heart hammered in his chest. The tent's thin walls seemed to pulse with every word, as if the very fabric of the place resonated with the terror that had seized Owen in his last hours there. He lingered on the warning, reading it over and over. Words once spoken in another lifetime, a grandmother's tale, perhaps meant to frighten children on stormy nights, now took on a sharp, urgent edge. Don't let it say your name. He tried to make sense of it, to rationalize. Isolated, cold, starving. The mind played tricks. The wind howled, tree branches scraped at the roof in the night, sounding like claws. But another memory pricked at the corners of his thoughts, the scratching at the tent last night, not animal nor human. The strange, ragged footprints, laced with blood, that vanished at the edge of the clearing. He could not forget that trail, disappearing as if something had melted through the snow without a trace. A small cry escaped from Freddie, drawing James's gaze. His friend's face was pale and drenched with sweat, lips moving silently around words that would not form. He looked so frail, so terribly human and breakable. James felt a surge of guilty determination. He could not afford to lose himself to fear. Not yet. Still clutching the journal as if it were an anchor, James inched toward the tent's opening. The world outside appeared unchanged. The forest was indifferent to the plight of men. Its trees skeletal, limbs coated in crystalline white. But now, each shadow seemed tenebrous, each space between tree trunks dark and deep. Owen, too, must have looked out into this maelstrom of frozen silence and seen something neither man nor beast. James imagined him clutching the small notebook, frantic, knowing he was running out of words and time. The world in which they had trusted the evidence of their senses, of animal tracks, of weather patterns, now felt fragile, easily shattered by the intrusion of a thing that did not belong in the taxonomy of survival guides. James closed his eyes and steadied his breath. Was there truly a monster, something ancient and predatory in these woods? Or was the fear itself its own form of ancient ancestral terror, awakening stories old as the cold? He thought of Owen's last written words, desperate and pleading, "If you look too long, it learns your name." What did that mean? That the act of seeing, of acknowledging, the creature somehow gave it power? A chill ran up his spine, deeper even than the cold that gnawed at his skin. He pictured something pale and tall, wedged between trees, motionless except when unseen. He wondered whether it had been there all along, watching, waiting. And he remembered, with sickening clarity, the rising fear of last night. The sensation that the darkness itself was listening, learning. The feeling of being watched had become something heavier, something personal, as if the woods themselves were whispering. A gust of wind rattled the tent. James turned away from the opening, clutching Owen's journal to his chest, careful not to look too long at the shifting groves beyond. He forced himself to listen for any trace of movement, anything that might betray an intruder. But all he could hear was Freddy's labored breath, the hiss of the wind, the distant creak of snow-laden branches. He resolved then not to speak Owen's name aloud, not to hurl it, his friend, his lost companion, into the abyss that might echo it back. He would guard the precious identities of everyone in the camp, aware now of the weight a name could hold in a place ruled by stories and superstitions. The sun rose a few more inches in the sky, washing the snow in a milky yellow glow. Yet the cold seemed to intensify. James realized that whatever had taken Owen, it might not be sated. Something had learned to hunt them, not for food, but for names, for memory, for the meaning of fear itself. He slipped the journal into his coat, hugging it close, and crawled back to Freddy's side. They would need every ounce of warmth, both physical and psychic, to survive the long day ahead, and the longer night yet to come. He steeled himself against the deceitful quiet, alert for the first sign of movement that proved something else still shared the wood. For now, he did not dare to speak, not a single name, not even his own. When consciousness returned, it was thin and fleeting, hovering at the edge of pain and fear. James's eyes refused to open at first. In the frost-numbed darkness behind his eyelids, he felt the icy sting of snow along his cheek, the slow seep of cold through his clothes, a cold deeper than he had ever known before. Somewhere nearby, the wind howled, shrieking through the pines like some ancient beast calling out its claim on the night. James blinked. Shadows loomed overhead, branches slick with ice, bending low as if to listen. Distant, almost hidden beneath the wind's roar, he heard a voice, so soft it could have been the memory of a voice. Freddy's words from hours before replayed in James's mind. "It just wants one of us." A jolt of adrenaline burned away some of the fog. James forced himself to sit up. The world spun wildly. He clutched at the crusted snow, heart pounding, teeth chattering so hard they threatened to shatter. The campsite's glow was gone, swallowed by the forest. In its place, only the shapeless expanse of trees and the relentless, suffocating hush that pressed in all around. He didn't know how long he'd lain there. Seconds? Hours? Night still reigned, and the clouds curled heavy across the sky, blotting out moon and stars alike. Snowflakes spiraled silently down, filling the outlines of footprints, erasing all trace of man or beast. A wheezing gasp jerked his attention behind him. James spun, body tense, every nerve on fire with dread. For a moment, there was nothing, just the stretch of white and the forest's chill breath. Then a shape resolved from the gloom, lurching from tree to tree, half crawling, half staggering. Freddy. Or what was left of him. His skin shone sickly pale beneath the flicker of the northern lights that trickled through a gap in the clouds. The knife dangled from his frozen hand, but it was his face that James couldn't look away from. A rise and fall of familiar features stretched into something desperate, pleading. Eyes rimmed with tears and an expression so lost it cut deeper than any blade. "James!" His voice was raw, almost gone, dragging like an animal's growl through the night. I tried not to listen." James's lips fumbled for words, but no sound emerged. He took a shaky step back, cold filling every inch left vacant by fear. From the darkness behind Freddy, another shadow slid between the trees, taller than a man. It watched, unseen except for the way the snow refused to settle on it, the way the silence deepened wherever it passed. James's heart hammered in his throat. The thing seemed almost curious, waiting, patient, its hunger a force that warped the very night. Freddie dropped to his knees, weeping. "It won't leave, James. Not till it gets what it wants. It's in my head, in all the shadows. I thought maybe if you made it out." The thing moved closer, silent as snowfall, the forest itself bending away from its passage. James felt a chill, thick, suffocating, more than mere winter. The whisper began. Not a voice, not really, but a thought, sliding along the raw edges of fear and exhaustion, curling into his mind. Give in. The cold will end. The hunger will end. Just one more step. But James fought. Even as the edges of his vision blurred and the world tilted, he staggered backward. He would not listen. Not now. The thing's presence pressed harder, but James turned and ran, half stumbling, half crawling, into the storm-lashed wild beyond. Behind him, darkness and hunger circled. The whisper faded, but not completely. Not ever. In the haunted silence of the snowbound forest, James ran, chased by the knowledge that something ancient and patient was waiting, always waiting for the moment when hope faltered and the dark was all that remained. James stood, shivering at the edge of the ruined clearing, every fiber of his body taut with the kind of fear that threatened to become its own frozen agony. The destruction of their camp was almost too much to process. The muted black bones of tents clawing at the grey sky, the charred remains of supplies, the eerie stillness where laughter and life had once pulsed in the frozen night. He searched the wreckage desperately for any sign of Freddie, but the only clue was that horrible streak, blood frozen in grotesque ribbons, dragging off into the unresolved depths of the forest. The woods pressed close, every branch rimed with glittering frost, every shadow stretching long and uncanny in the wan morning sun. The silence had changed, becoming heavier, as if the world itself was drawing attention inward, toward the broken clearing, and to James, standing alone and very, very small. As he took a faltering step toward the blood trail, the whispering returned. Ja! Meh. The stretched syllables unraveled and reened along the wind, threading between the pines. A sound both impossibly distant and intimately close, as if spoken directly into the hollow of his ear. His skin crawled with dread. That voice did not belong to anyone he knew. It was a warped echo, familiar in form but wrong in substance, like a mask stretched across a form beneath. James swallowed hard, trying to tamp his terror, and called out again, "Freddie!" But even as his voice broke the silence, he knew he would not be answered by the man he searched for. The forest seemed to recoil, funneling all noise into the oppressive hush that followed, amplifying the crunch of his boots in the crusted snow, the ragged hitch of his own breathing. With no better choice, James began to follow the blood trail. Each step was a bargain with hope and fear. Hope that he might find Freddie alive, fear that whatever had done this lurked in the ever-deepening gloom among the trees. The footprints alongside the blood were clumsy, dragging, and soon they were joined by other marks. Strange impressions in the snow, too large, too many-toed, pressed into the earth with a force that made him shudder. The farther he went, the deeper the shadows grew. The whisper followed, now and then flaring up blatantly, James, from somewhere ahead, sometimes behind, the same breathless mimicry. His heart hammered, pulse thudding in time with each repetition of his name. He caught himself glancing back, half expecting to see the forest had swallowed the clearing, as if the world before had never existed. Only the trail of blood gave shape to his path, an anchor in an increasingly alien landscape. He heard a branch snap, sharp and close, and spun to find nothing but the quick flutter of falling frost and branches heavy with snow. His fingers throbbed with cold, his head ached, but every sense was alight with dread. Deep in the woods, even the day seemed to dim. The light bent oddly here, pooling in blue shadows, distorting the shapes of trees into looming giants. The wind sent the whispers skittering around him, lacing fear into the marrow of his bones. James clung to the memory of Freddy's laugh, of the warmth of the campfire, and forced himself onward. The blood path grew fresher, brighter against the snow, and at last opened into another clearing. This one undisturbed, as if untouched by man or beast. But the feeling of being watched had returned, colder and sharper than ever, as though the trees themselves carried eyes that tracked his every move. Breath-frosten. The night pressed in around James, dense and sharpened by terror. Every heartbeat pounded louder than the whispering wind, which carried the faint stench of rot and the sickly sweetness of burned flesh. He was rooted to the ground, unable to tear his eyes away from the horrific tableau before him. Freddy, his friend, his companion through cold and hardship, was now a ghastly reflection of humanity's darkest hunger, crouched over remains that had once been someone they both knew. James's mind reeled, his memories of Freddy, the laughter, the shared stories, the promises of survival clashing with the monstrous thing before him. The way Freddy worked the bone, gnawing with mechanical desperation, belonged to an animal at the edge of starvation, not the friend James had known. Blood coated Freddy's face, his lips and chin dripping red in the flickering glow of the dying fire. The snow around him was stained, a gruesome spread of proof that this horror had not just begun. But what had changed Freddy into this nightmare? James only needed to look a little further. The trees behind the ruined campfire seemed to split open, and from their shadow stepped a thing that did not belong to this world. Its form was enormous, hunched and twisted, its limbs impossibly long and carved with sinews that pulsed beneath ridged, bark-like skin. The creature's horns curled outward, catching the faint firelight, and from beneath them, blazing eyes fixed unblinking on James. The legends had whispered about it in shivering tones. The Wendigo, spirit of insatiable hunger. Now that myth breathed and watched, asserting its icy dominion over the forest and every trembling soul within it. Each breath the creature took seemed to chill the clearing even further, the snow brittle and glassy beneath its feet. James felt the ancient weight of the curse bearing down on him. The stories told by elders around distant fires, warnings wrapped in riddles. When you taste the flesh of your kin, you invite the hunger that never ends. He saw that truth writ grotesquely in Freddy's transformed body, in the void where a person once lived, now only occupied by an unending craving. Freddy's movement drew James's gaze once more. He crouched low, almost reverently proffering the gnawed bone as if seeking approval from the looming shape behind him. His motions were jerky, puppet-like, guided by some uncanny force. Tears mingled with blood on his cheeks. a final vestige of the friend James had known flickering, and then, with a blink, extinguished. The Wendigo leaned closer, its burning eyes narrowing. James could feel a pressure building inside his skull, as if the creature's presence clawed at his very thoughts, urging him toward despair. The words of Freddy, so strangled and alien, hung in the air. It doesn't kill you, it changes you, makes you like it. Somewhere beneath his dread, James's survival instincts screamed to run, to bolt for the tree line and the uncertain safety beyond. But his body faltered, every muscle locked in the raw animal terror of prey. The ground seemed to shift, snow and earth compacting as the Wendigo's shadow lengthened. Its maw opened, rows of jagged teeth glistening, and the air filled with the scent of death and winter. James understood then. The forest itself was complicit, compounding the curse, closing ranks around him. To stay would mean transformation, a slide into the same ravenous oblivion that now claimed Freddy. But to flee, to resist, would require a strength James was no longer certain he possessed. As the Wendigo's guttural growl rumbled across the clearing, James faced the choice that centuries of desperate souls had faced under cursed skies: surrender to the hunger or fight, with the last shreds of humanity desperately clinging to his heart. The world had fallen eerily silent, the storm's fury fading to a hushed stillness as James lay motionless, breath rising in shivering gasps. Snowflakes drifted down, settling on his cheeks, clinging to the threadbare remains of his clothes. The forest pressed close around him, skeletal trees standing guard, their limbs laden with the constant white. Somewhere in the distance, a branch cracked under its own weight, but it sounded as distant as memory. His vision swam, ghostly shapes dancing behind his eyelids. The shadow's voice curled softly through his mind, patient, soothing, intimate, a lullaby for the dying. It reminded him of childhood fevers, the gentle hand of his mother stroking his brow. Warmth and hunger, love and pain threaded together beyond reason. The voice blended with his thoughts, impossible to differentiate. Just a little, just one bite. Images flickered through the fog, pale flesh torn from bone, the blood blooming bright on the white snow. The urge throbbed inside him, impossibly loud. His humanity and horror warred as the shadow pressed closer, eager, unhurried. His body, gaunt and wasted, screamed its need. But beneath the hunger, a spark still smoldered. A fragment of self, stubborn, angry, refusing to be snuffed out. James clung to memories sharper than hunger, more real than the visions. His father's laugh, the warmth of summer sun, the soft weight of a book in his hand. The flicker of another life, before the cold, before the fear. What would his father say if he saw him now? Would he understand or turn away in pity? The idea stung more than the cold. He remembered Freddy, the look in his friend's eyes, hollow, desperate, apologetic as he offered that tainted meat. Was it mercy or resignation? Did any of them truly choose, or did hunger choose for them? Did survival mean surrender, or was it something else? Something harder and lonelier. James lay on his back, marrow aching, and listened to the wind in the trees. He pressed his face against the snow, numbness spreading, promising an end to suffering. It whispered the most seductive promise: oblivion, free from need. For a moment, he let himself drift, cold and weightless. He thought about giving in, about letting the shadow take him completely, about closing his eyes and never waking. And yet, he did not let go. Some primal anger fleshed it up, hot and furious. He would not die like this, not in surrender, not consumed by something hungry and cold, not a beast, not just another body in the snow. With aching effort, he rolled to his side, pulling his knees under him. Each movement was agony. Every muscle burned, every joint screamed out. His fingers, numb and blue, dug into the crusted snow. Tiny victories, each small movement a refusal to give up. He whimpered through cracked lips, choking back another bitter laugh. The shadow's pressure grew heavier, and the voice sharpened, mocking, cajoling, promising relief. But James closed his mind to it as best he could. He was more than hunger, more than the shadow inside him. If he lived, it would be by his own choosing. Snow turned to blood as he dragged himself forward, inch by inch, mouth full of ice and grit. The world had shrunk to a single choice: surrender or endure. James chose to survive not as a monster but as himself. And as the first blue light of dawn crept through the skeletal trees, James kept moving, refusing the cold, refusing the hunger, clinging to the last fragile threads of hope. Just when James thought it was over, when the cold had taken everything and the forest would finally consume him, light appeared. Blinding, unnatural, human. A helicopter spotlight cut through the trees like a blade of fire. Voices shouted. Footsteps crunched in the snow. He was found. A search team, organized by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, had been combing the forest for days. They had nearly given up, but there he was, barely alive, frostbitten, delirious, but breathing. They pulled his skeletal body from the snow and flew him to a remote field hospital. James was saved. The clinic's fluorescent lights hummed on as the night deepened, the glow casting more shadows than it chased away. James lay beneath his blankets, eyes shining in the semi-darkness, the edges of his thoughts raw with desperation. The staff moved around him gently, their voices hushed. Word had already spread of his condition, that he was the young man found against all odds, brought back from the jaws of winter. But what survived that ordeal wasn't so easily named. He barely slept, and when he did, his dreams were red and feral. Ghostly replays of the forest silence interrupted by the gnawing ache that twisted inside him, never sated. When he woke, his stomach burned and turned, refusing nourishment like an animal gone rogue. The kindness of the nurses, the gentle hands and lilted voices became irritating, too soft for the coarseness he felt scraping inside his soul. Every bowl of soup rejected, every attempt at comfort spat back. Whispers followed him down the hallways, but when anyone met his eyes, they quickly looked away. Doctors gathered in briefing rooms, paging through medical journals and case studies, murmuring about trauma and extreme deprivation. They charted his declining weight, tested his blood for infections or imbalances. The science never made sense. What do you do when all explainable answers lead nowhere but to fear? One nurse, young and eager, tried to comfort him one evening. She offered him a peeled banana, assuring him in a soft voice that this would help. He accepted it, his hands trembling, but as soon as it touched his tongue, his body rejected it violently. When he looked up, his eyes locked on the nurse's wrist, a flash of exposed skin under the sleeve. His nostrils flared, and for the briefest moment, pity rolled over her face before she snatched her hand away. Respect turned to wariness. At first, nobody understood the nature of his hunger. The staff assumed trauma, delirium, the after effects of cold and isolation. But then came the confession, a whisper in the darkness, spoken almost to himself. "I can't eat unless it's raw." The word hung in the air, heavy and dangerous, like a secret best left buried. No one responded. The doctor on duty made a note in his chart, her fingers trembling. The night nurse shifted uncomfortably, casting glances over her shoulder as if expecting shadows to reach for her. They hadn't spoken about legends or folklore, but the story went around the staff rooms anyway. Tales of the Wendigo, devourer of men, spirit of the starving wild. James had been lost in that winter wood, they all knew, where stories said a man might give in to anything just to survive. They ordered more tests. Nutritionists visited, trying to craft new meal plans, but James stared through them, silent, his deepening hunger betraying itself in sunken cheeks and predatory eyes. One orderly, ashen with fear, reported seeing him prowling his room late at night. Barefoot, silent. The village nearby buzzed with rumors. Some said the forest north of the village was cursed, haunted by more than wild animals. James had become a ghost story before he'd even left his hospital bed. A warning whispered to children, a caution against venturing too deep into the cold. Days passed, and though James's body seemed to mend, the man himself faded. He grew restless and feverish, muttering in his sleep. The nurses took turns watching over him, but none wanted the night shift. The unspoken fear grew that the thing pulled from the snow was not just a man who had survived, but something else entirely. Across the halls, doors were locked and meals prepared with caution. Meat kept far from his room. And always outside, the winter waited, implacable, hungry, endless. Rescue had brought James from the wild, but with him had come something neither medicine nor kindness could reach. The awful hunger did not fade. And in the long Canadian winter, everyone began to wonder what truly survived when a man returns from the edge of the world. 2 months had passed since James last breathed the sterile air of his hospital room. The memory of white walls and faint antiseptic scent still clinging at the edges of his mind. When he stepped out into the world, sunlight washed over him, softer than he remembered, full of familiar warmth, yet failing to reach some part of him deep within. To the townsfolk, he was the living embodiment of resilience, a man reborn, no longer the ragged spectre they'd once found at the edge of the ravaged forest. James shook hands, accepted tight hugs, and offered polite smiles. Faces glowed with admiration. He was hailed not as a victim, but as a testament to the unbreakable will that drove humans to persist, even in the face of the impossible. He did all that was asked of him. He recounted his ordeal with detached clarity for the authorities, sticking to the story he had chosen. In that official account, Owen was simply lost, swallowed by a landscape that showed no mercy. Freddie, the last to vanish, had been taken by the blizzard, dissolved into wind and snow like so many before him. James signed the forms, slid his thin, sanitized words across desks, and watched as men in uniform stamped "Case closed" on the file. No one thought to ask what was missing from his account. No one wondered about the unspoken things. Things heard on windless nights, hunger that scraped like claws along the inside of an empty stomach, or the grinding terror that sometimes wore the face of a friend. Yet for those who spent time by James's bedside, the story did not end with the closing of a file. Nurses, orderlies, and the night staff whispered among themselves about the survivor whose restless eyes traced patterns against the darkness beyond the window. He never slept at night, not truly. Attendants found him countless times, perched in the narrow shaft of moonlight, back rigid as he stared out past the floodlights to where the tree line pressed tight against the world, as if expecting some invisible force to break through the brush at any moment. The staff spoke in hushed voices about how James always kept a hunting knife beneath his pillow, not as a token, but as a lifeline. The blade was never dull, and he inspected its mirrored surface obsessively, as though searching it for answers. When winter crept upon the land once again, casting long shadows and pulling breath into clouds of frost, James slipped away. No goodbyes, no explanation, just a lingering echo of footsteps through the snow. A door left quietly ajar. Some claimed to spot him wandering north, vanishing into the wilderness, as if drawn by something magnetic. Rumors grew in his absence that he was tracking a beast whose howl haunted his dreams, or that he exiled himself to keep the darkness inside him from reaching anyone else. That maybe he was not hunting at all, but hiding from what he had become, or feared he might still become. As years passed, stories blossomed and twisted. Some townsfolk spoke of a guardian haunting the forest's edge, warning travelers away from paths best left untraveled. Others whispered of a man's shadow moving in the trees just before a storm, tall and silent as the pines. They argued whether he was brave or broken, haunted or hunting, but all agreed on one truth. Whatever happened in the snowbound wilderness had never truly released its hold on James, because survival, they all knew, never comes free. It extracts its payment in quiet moments and sleepless nights, in caution, sharpened to paranoia. And for some, once a certain darkness has settled inside, it can never be fully chased away. The forest leaves its mark, even as the world shakes your hand, smiles, and celebrates. James survived. Yet the real story is not about those who stay, but about what follows us home, and how sometimes the cost of survival is never being able to forget. Epilogue: The Hunter's Note. In the frozen heart of winter 1971, the wilderness surrounding Coldwater Lake could swallow sound, silencing even the wind beneath towering pines and drifting snow. Here, where isolation pressed in from all sides and the landscape wore a shroud of white, Russell, a man hardened by decades spent in the woods, pressed cautiously onward. Few ventured this deep when the season turned harsh, but the call of the hunt, and perhaps something less tangible, had drawn him far from familiar trails. There was wisdom in Russell's movements, each careful step through the undergrowth, a lifetime's lessons reminding him to move lightly, to blend with the stillness. These practices, learned from elders and honed by personal trial, sustained him where others might falter. The air was razor-sharp, each inhale stinging nostrils and lungs, every exhale visible, mingling with the falling flakes. Yet even for such an experienced woodsman, the forest held surprises. On this day, the monotony of white and green was broken by an unnatural shape, a sagging, snow-capped tent, its canvas battered by years of exposure. A corner had collapsed, edges lifting just enough to show a glimpse within. The discovery prickled at Russell's instincts. A structure where none should be. Evidence of another's presence waning under the weight of time. Curiosity, that quiet companion of all who walk the wild, compelled him closer. He brushed snow from the entrance and ducked inside, bracing himself for whatever he might find. He took in the scene. Rags of old gear, a long cold lantern, and the unmistakable disorder that marks a place abandoned in haste or distress. It was beneath a weathered sleeping bag that he discovered the tin box, a relic sealed and hidden. The metal corroded, but not broken. His hands, gloved and trembling slightly more from anticipation than cold, worked against the frozen latch. At last, the lid yielded, revealing its contents. A journal, its cover cracked, its binding fragile with age and frost. Returning to his own camp as dusk began to creep through the trees, Russell placed the journal near his fire, allowing the warmth to free the pages from their icy grasp. They revealed a script growing more hurried and desperate with each entry, words sometimes slanted wildly as though no time remained. He reread of hunger and fear, of strange sounds in the night, and a growing dread that turned to terror on those final pages. It was the last entry that struck deepest. A message scrawled in letters barely legible, the ink running thin, the spacing uncertain. It never leaves, it's always hungry, and if you survive, you become it. I saw myself in the mirror, and it was laughing. A simple signature, JH. Russell sat motionless for a long while, the flames of his fire flickering uncertainly as the wind began to stir, carrying with it the cries of distant wolves, or perhaps something else entirely. The myths he'd heard around countless campfires, a shape drifting in the shadows, hungering, haunting, never satisfied, seemed now less like stories, more like premonitions. He let the meaning settle, heavy and unyielding. The Wendigo, no tall tale, no fading ghost story, but a tangible and terrifying presence, bound to the ravaged soul of a man who once fought against starvation and madness and lost himself completely. Russell understood then that winter held more than cold and loneliness. It bore the secrets of those who vanished, warnings etched in frail journals and left for others to find. Here, in the icy silence, something watched and waited. Somewhere in the snow, hunger still walked. As Russell stared into the fire, the last embers glowed against the dark, casting shapes that danced and leapt like specters. He listened to the silence, wondering what tomorrow's sun would reveal and if he, too, might someday leave behind a note in the frost, a final warning for whoever was next to brave the depths of these haunted woods.